Good morning, everybody. I'm Ambassador James Jeffrey. I'm the chair of the Wilson Center Middle East program. I would like to welcome you this morning to our program, the Middle East North Africa Economic Outlook 2021 Challenges and Opportunities. We have a terrific speaker today from the IMF. We have Mr. Jihad Azour, who is the director of the Middle East and Central Asia Department. I'm going to turn this over to our director, Marisa Huma, in a second, but I just want to underline, while we focus, particularly at the beginning of a new administration, on dramatic events in the Middle East, nuclear negotiations, rocket attacks, efforts to find new relations with old friends throughout the region, the underlying issues that we at the Wilson Center try to focus on as well are very, very important. These involve social issues, these involve labor, these involve the role of women, these involve the internal cohesion of societies, and undergirding all of that is economics. So therefore, we're delighted today to do this program. And once again, thank you, Jihad, for doing this. Marisa, over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Jeffrey, for your introduction, and welcome Dr. Jihad Azour, who is, as Jim mentioned, Director of the MENA region at the IMF, where he oversees basically the fund's work across the region, but also Central Asia and the Caucasus. Dr. Azour served as Lebanon's finance minister, during which he coordinated the implementation of important reforms, including modernizing the country's tax and customs system. And before being a finance minister, he had many positions in the private sector. So thank you for being with us this morning. We're delighted to host you to help us navigate, as Ambassador Jeffrey mentioned, the MENA region's economic outlook for the coming year. Last year was particularly challenging, of course, worldwide, but particularly for the MENA region and its people. Many countries paid the price economically for very strict lockdowns that were enacted at the beginning of the pandemic. Jobs were lost, particularly amongst youth and women, which is a phenomenon we've seen here also in the United States. The informal sector was severely impacted with no social protections in place to provide a cushion. And also this was coupled with sharp fluctuations in the oil market. So for the oil exporters of the region, it was certainly a double whammy. So we're very curious to see what this economic outlook looks like in 2021 to better understand how things will change as countries start to recover, as they start to roll out vaccinations, and as governments continue to grapple with the rapid spread of the new variants, with very exhausted healthcare systems, which in many parts of the region were already in poor conditions and had to basically endure this pandemic for the last 11 months plus. So we will begin with remarks from you, Dr. Azour. We'll have a discussion with myself and Ambassador Jeffrey, and then we'll turn it to all of you in the audience watching or listening. So if you do have a question, please submit it on Twitter to @WilsonCenterMEP, or you can email it to mep@wilsoncenter.org. And with that, Jihad, I will give you the virtual floor.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for hosting me this morning at the Wilson Center. Thank you, Marisa. Well, where to start? Let me first start by saying that we are at a very interesting moment for the region. We're turning the page of the first year of the outbreak of the COVID-19 shock in the region. The region was one of those that were the most affected by the crisis itself. And as you said, Marisa, we had a double whammy in the region, and in certain cases, triple shocks. Of course, a year after that, one can reflect on what has happened in 2020, and I will allude to this very quickly and happy to go into more details about how this crisis has affected the region and what are the issues that we need to focus on in rebuilding the future. But also, we are at a point where the outlook for this year will be pretty much determined by the race between the vaccine and the virus. Recently, we saw a second wave emerging in most of the countries. About 70% of the countries are facing a second, or in certain cases, third wave. And this one is, I would say, faster in terms of spreading and fatal. The number of fatality is higher in this one compared to the last one. However, measures in terms of containment, in terms of treatment, have improved, and a lot of lessons were learned from the previous phase. Yet, the vaccine will play an important role in shaping up the recovery in the region. And therefore, after a year in 2020, like we have not seen in a century, it was a crisis like no other. Almost all countries, except very few, Egypt, one of them, had to contract and had negative growth, and also had to face multiple shocks, volatility in oil price, drop in remittances for some, and a crisis that affected sectors that are very much, in fact, important in job creation, like tourism in some other countries. This year, vaccine is going to play an important role because acceleration of the vaccination will allow countries to recover faster. And in our study, it's showing that only by accelerating vaccination, you can get an additional 0.4 to 0.5% growth this year. And the opposite is also the same. If you delay vaccination, you will delay the recovery. And therefore, access to vaccine is going to be important. And here we see three categories of countries. You have the leaders, and some of them are worldwide leaders like UAE, Bahrain, among the first to get access to the vaccine, accelerate inoculation, and diversify the sources of vaccination. You have another group of countries who have already started the process, and some of them are producing, like Egypt or Morocco. And you have the third group, who are the laggards, those who are dependent on certain limited number of sources. COVAX is one of them, and they don't expect to provide vaccination for more than 20 or 30% of their population in 2021. And this is going to be an issue. The second important issue that will define how the economy will recover this year in the region is the policies and how these policies will help address the issues that countries are facing currently. And here, let me, in fact, go very quickly over those. The first group of policies are those that are needed to protect lives. Procuring vaccine, providing resources to the medical system, and also provide support to livelihood is the first group of policies. And those policies, we recommend countries to keep implementing no matter what their financial situation is. The second category are the other fiscal measures that are needed in order to provide a floor to the economy. The fact that the crisis has expanded beyond to 2020 would require additional measures this year. And those measures are to protect small and medium-sized companies and also address some of the weaknesses that we saw, like, for example, the large size of informal sector that affects the ability of the economy to recover. Three is the other measures that are needed in order to maintain the economy active, access to finance, the role that the central banks have played in terms of providing facilities through interest rate, as well as also through liquidity. Those three, I would say, level of measures are going to be important. They need to be more focused, and they need to be more targeted. Focused in time and targeted in terms of addressing the issues that emerged in 2021. And therefore, for this year, we expect that the whole region will witness a positive growth of 3.1%. And this comes after a year, 2020, where we had a negative growth of 3.8%. It's a jump, but it's still not enough in order for many of the countries to recover the ground lost in 2020. And therefore here we need to, I would say, cluster countries. Oil exporting countries will recover faster thanks to three things. One is the steps that those countries took very early, especially in the GCC, in order to expand the medical coverage and to provide and procure the vaccine on time. This group also of countries is being helped this year by the recovery in oil price, with an oil price at $63 the barrel today. The ground that was lost in 2020 is recovered. Mind you that in 2020, we saw oil prices at low 20s, the lowest in 3 decades, and in real term, even lower than 1973 oil price. Therefore, it was a big shock. And therefore, we have to be cautious because oil price is still volatile and depends on several other factors. But also, we saw Q4 in many of those countries where the economy recovered faster. We have a second group, the group of, I would say, the emerging countries, the Egypt, Morocco, Jordan, Tunisia, and others. Those where, because of the diversity of the economy, were able to withstand the shock in a better way, but the level of vulnerabilities are higher. And on average, that will exceed 90% of GDP. And this is another issue that those countries are facing. It limited their capacity last year to provide stimulus package that were commensurate to the shock. But this year, also, it will make them more dependent on the outlook in the capital markets and their ability to get access to finance. And the third category are the group of conflict and fragile states. And here we have the Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Libya. Those are different type of issues that those countries are facing, but they have certain number of common issues. One, weak institutions, limited access to vaccine and medical support. And those countries in 2020 endured a much bigger contraction in their economy. On average, their economy declined by more than 12%. And they need longer period to recover. Therefore, 2021 is a pivotal year. It's a year of a reset. This year, for some of those countries, will also become the year of planning the recovery. And we're seeing certain number of countries already setting up, I would say, certain number of plans in order to accelerate the recovery. And the recovery here in the region can be accelerated by focusing on some of the silver linings. And let me, to illustrate, give 3 examples. One, technology. Technology played an important role in the region in 2020 in several forms. Electronic payments and mobile money helped provide capacity to provide social assistance in many countries. I give the example of Morocco, where the state was able to provide support to 5 million families in the informal sector through electronic payment. We saw this also playing an important role in remittances and channeling remittances and reducing the cost of remittances. Technology also played an important role in providing social remote services. And here, I think it's one of also the lessons that countries who were able to work remotely were able to recover faster. And therefore, technology will play an important role. The second dimension that is going to also be critical in the future is investment in climate change. We saw that this is an important issue that in certain countries have accelerated or increased the pressure of the shock. In countries like Morocco, where the drought, for example, contributed to the negative growth, those are issues that several countries in the region are facing. Greening the recovery and planning a recovery around certain number of sectors that will allow, like renewable energy and other type of investment, will help the region also accelerate the transformation. Last but not the least, I think we saw that the capacity in the region in order to be flexible and resilient is something that will allow a faster recovery in the future. And this is thanks to the role of youth and women. And this is something that also this crisis has highlighted the need to invest in helping those have a better access to market. Women were faced with the challenge of working remotely, as well as also the youth. And therefore, investing in new infrastructure in education and in other type of public services that will allow those categories to participate into the economic recovery will be important for the future. And to finish, I would say, brushing the outlook for 2021, it's important to highlight two things. That international economic outlook matters, and it matters in form of the impact on trade. Last year, we saw trade declining by 12%, and this has affected several countries who have been more and more integrated into the global value chain. Global outlook is also important for the financial situation for those countries. 40% of the emerging market issuance in 2020 came from the region. It was for many countries the security valve that allowed them to get access to financing. And for some of them, the conditions of financing were even more favorable than any time before. Therefore, what we will see in the international capital markets will also have an impact on the region. Oil price and oil demand will also play an important role. Of course, one would ask the question about how about the geopolitical issues? Of course, they are important, but I would say in terms of macroeconomic aggregate, they come as part of the overall picture. What we need to focus on, and where the fund is focusing on this year, after last year where we provided a rapid support to countries in the region, $17 billion of emergency facilities in order to help countries deal with the COVID-19 shock. This year, we're focusing our support more in helping countries recover, like we did with Egypt with a program of $5.8 billion, like we did with Jordan or with Morocco, but also helping countries who don't have access to markets like Yemen, where we provided grants, or Somalia, where we provided debt relief. We're currently working with Sudan on that. We're trying to help Lebanon and Iraq also achieve this. But I would say more importantly, we are trying to help countries designing policies, because we think we are at a turning point, and not accelerating the transformation of the economies in the region could lead to a lost decade, like the one we saw after the global financial crisis, where countries in the region did not understand the magnitude of the shock and delayed the recovery, and it costed them a lot, because the growth was slower than other comparable countries, and led to a high increase in unemployment and increase in vulnerabilities. Still, the main issue for the region is inclusion, but I think now the avenues to achieve this need to be updated. And this is what we are trying to do with the region, and I'll be happy to discuss further what are the policy recommendations and the policy issues that the region faces. Mercer, let me stop here. I'm sure that there are other issues that I did not cover that maybe in our discussion we will have the opportunity to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Jihad. This was a very comprehensive presentation, and you gave us both the challenges and the opportunities for 2021. And that's, I find that very hopeful with particularly the silver linings. I want to sort of take you back to, you just mentioned the issue of inclusion, and you talked about youth and women in particular. And we both are from the region. Many of our audience are familiar with the region. And I think everyone knows that the region has suffered very high youth unemployment and one of the lowest female labor participation rates in the world for decades to come. And many reforms have taken place, perhaps not enough has been done to address that. And this pandemic sort of even exacerbated an already challenging situation. And you mentioned that this is one of the policy recommendations that you want to put forward to address both of these groups that are in a way economically disenfranchised. So what is it that the governments can do differently that they have not done in the past in order to address this challenge, and perhaps use this crisis as an opportunity to move forward? And given all the different disruptions that we've seen to the workplace with the inclusion of technology, and the asymmetries that we see in the labor market, which continue until today with the skills mismatch in particular?
Thank you very much. Is the I would say the most important question for the future of the region. Of course, the aspiration of the youth and women were not met in the last decade, because when we look at the statistics, the level of women participation did not grow enough compared to other parts of the world. And also the role of the youth in the economy is still relatively limited. In a recent study we did prior to the COVID-19 shock, we showed that if you only increase the level of women participation to be half of what it is in other emerging economies in comparable countries, you could create $1 trillion of new output in 10 years. It tells you the importance of improving women participation. And we saw it firsthand in some of our programs in Jordan or in Egypt. It plays an important role. It leads me to my first point. The recovery has to be centered around people. And it means that you need to change the way you provide public services, the way you provide education that allows people to be at the center of any recovery program. The second thing is there are a certain number of challenges that exist and can be addressed. Access to finance. Access to finance is one of the lowest worldwide, 6% of GDP in terms of funding provided to small and medium-sized companies and startups. If only we reach the level of emerging economies, 14%, we can increase the level of growth by 2 to 3% on average for the next 5 years. Three, governance. Improving governance is also one of the biggest issues that the region is facing. And this is at the essence of the confidence between citizen and state. And there is one lesson that we learned from 2020 is confidence plays an important role in even the behavior of citizens. Four, you cannot grow the economy today in the region when you have 2/3 of your population below 30, without promoting activities and sectors that are job rich. And here technology plays an important role. Over the past few decades, government resorted to public employment in order to provide social protection. I think we need to change the paradigm. Social spending in the region is low. It has improved over the past, but it's still low. It's between 2 to 6% on average. It has to go up. And for this to increase, you need to change the way you look at your budget. You need to free some of your resources. You need to adjust the way you provide subsidies that are currently untargeted and benefiting the high end, and focus those subsidies more to those who need it, and therefore move more toward targeting. Addressing informal sector is also one area that has been revealed during the crisis. It limited the capacity of the state to provide social assistance to those. And without formalizing those activities, you will keep big potential of your economy untapped. Therefore, I would say the pieces are there. What is needed is, as you said, you need to have a coherent and ambitious program whereby you align all these elements into a forward-looking strategy that takes this challenge and turn it into an opportunity, address some of the bottlenecks that exist. Consider that social is also important for growth. Consider that currently you cannot catch up without investing in technology. And for you, it's a win-win, because investing in technology means you promote your highly educated young population. Of course, countries are different. And this is something that has to be country specific. But there are a certain number of things that can be done regionally. Technology you cannot play it at the country level. You need to develop standards that will allow the whole region to adopt certain standards. I'm happy to see that GCC have adopted the 5G at GCC level, but it's not enough. You need also to promote certain number of cross-country investments in technology, in climate issues, in allowing greater flexibility for people to move from one country to another. And we saw some good steps also from GCC countries recently. The complementarity that can exist between countries in the region can accelerate the recovery.
Thanks, Jihad. And since you mentioned the GCC and sort of a more regional approach, I want to take the opportunity to delve into the issue of cooperation, which in the blog that you published last week, you basically highlighted how critical it is to reducing the divergent paths to recovery. So what do you mean by, or how does this cooperation play out, particularly as we see some countries or some categories that you've outlined earlier doing a lot better, and a huge gap between those who are leading and other countries in the region that are, as we all know, in state of conflict and are thus very fragile?
Well, Marissa, the crisis showed us certain important revelations globally. The new global economy will privilege more shorter value chains, will privilege also regional linkages. And when you look at the region, take the example of Maghreb countries. They are among the least integrated in the world, then even less integrated than sub-Saharan Africa. And only by improving the level of exchange of goods and services between those countries and reducing some of the barriers, you could create between 0.5 to 1% growth in the Maghreb countries, a group of more than 100 million population, and make them an interesting and large market. Therefore, the old model of regional cooperation has to change and has to move from a cooperation to partnership. And this requires that certain number of practices are changed. Developing regional standards in terms of technology, in terms of digital money, in terms of certain number of standards is much more effective than all the agreements that are done top-down. Therefore, privilege more the creation of common standards, especially that the economy is more and more virtual, open up through aligning into comparable systems in terms of utilization of technology, etc., and open up certain number of service markets. This is one. Second, we saw that certain number of basic sectors are very promising. Food security also proved to be one of the key issues that countries faced during the 2020 crisis. And therefore, there is great complementarity between countries here, between Sudan and the GCC, for example, or even Yemen and the GCC, between Algeria, Morocco, and other countries in the region. Therefore, there are certain number of even traditional sectors that can play a role in promoting a greater regional cooperation. Three, where I think we are seeing some moves is on allowing capital and people to circulate freely. The removal of kafala in the GCC, providing capacity for people to work with their own visa and move from one job to another. Also, this is another model whereby it helps accelerating the diversification. It's definitely not something that you can reach in a very short period. This is something that would require some time, and also would require to modernize some of the regional institutions, be it the Arab League or some of the regional funds, in order to play the full role of, I would say, a conduit and a platform for those countries to work and more together. But this is definitely one of the areas where the next 5 to 10 years could provide an opportunity for countries to work together. And the recent Al-Awla agreement is a step in the right direction. We may not see the results in a short period of time, but this will allow gradually to remove the barriers that exist between countries in the region.
Thank you. And do you think in the short term, as the leaders are rolling out their vaccination plans very effectively, that once they've inoculated their populations, they will also be able to support those in the other two categories in order to just move past that sort of recovery phase and into the rebuilding?
Of course, and your blog last week, this is one of the main recommendations that we are, in fact, proposing to the region, giving the importance of the vaccine in the recovery, giving the importance of the vaccine in protecting lives and livelihoods. We are seeing a great opportunity here for countries of the region to work together and expanding the vaccination and making sure that there is a solidarity among countries in the region. Of course, this will not replace the global solidarity or the international solidarity, but I think this can amplify and accelerate this. And also, this will trickle down in terms of improving social conditions and reduce the risks of social unrest. If you go over, not only the last century, but few centuries in the past, those kind of big crises are moments of risks too, and could generate unrests. And it's very important to take those risks seriously. Also, it's very important to use this moment to accelerate through the vaccination the capacity to reduce the risk in the region, because when we can't vaccinate everyone, we cannot protect everyone too. Therefore, it's very important to do this. And this could be, I would say, first step, an important one, where the objective is very clear and the complementarity is obvious. And definitely, I think 2021 could be a year where regional cooperation in terms of vaccination, fighting the COVID-19, is a year that could open the way for further initiatives that maybe in the future could be around addressing climate issues, addressing water issues that are a contentious issue in the region, addressing also the issue of transmission of knowledge and technology, that also here can be a new opportunity for countries in the Middle East.
Yeah, thank you. And as you mentioned, the risks of social unrest are high. We've already seen actually protests in various parts of the region, in Tunisia, in Iraq, in Jordan, that are focused on jobs in particular. So this is certainly something that has to be addressed very urgently. I want to invite Ambassador Jeffrey to also ask a question, and we have a number of questions coming in from the audience. But before we turn to those, Ambassador Jeffrey.
Thank you, Marisa. Dr. Azour, you talked a bit about the GCC and more flexibility. How have its sovereign wealth funds fared? I've heard various somewhat conflicting reports over the past COVID and low oil price, more than a year that we're now experiencing. And can they be an engine for expanding even further the encouraging 40% of new investments you mentioned, or new placements in the region that you just talked about? Thank you.
Ambassador, you're raising a very important issue. Let me go 2 steps back. After 2015 drop in oil price, that was a shock for many of the GCC countries. They have started a new wave of diversification. And it was a multi-level type of diversification. They started diversifying their economies, or accelerate the diversification of their economies beyond oil. And they invested heavily in service sectors. But also they started to diversify their revenues by relying less on oil and more on other type of sources of revenues. And this, in fact, was successful in several countries like Saudi, UAE, and more recently in Bahrain. And the third level is to use their investment funds as also a conduit to accelerate some of their transformation. And the most recent one is what we saw with the PIF, the Public Investment Fund in Saudi, where the PIF has announced that they will be investing in the local economy something like $40 billion per year in order to accelerate diversification. Of course, we don't know the details of those, but it's a shift because historically, if you go back over the last 5 decades, the whole strategy was to diversify investment outside the region in order to have a kind of different type of investment and different type of risks and allow to have a long-term sustainable level of non-oil revenues. We see a change in that. And this is, of course, an important step. And here one has to be cautious or be cognizant of certain number of important issues. It is a step in the right direction in terms of opening up new sectors, but it should be complementary to what the private sector could do and not a competitive to what the private sector could do, because those countries need more private initiatives to grow and create jobs. This is one. Second is also very important that the strategy is, in fact, to open the way for private investment to come after, i.e. to privilege sectors where private investment is not very active these days. And this is something that we saw after the global financial crisis, that although we saw capital flows to the region, it was more in form of portfolio investment and less in terms of FDIs. And therefore, if this can trigger and attract additional FDIs from external sources, this is a welcome step, because it's not only about the financial resources, but about the know-how, the technology, the capacity to link those economies into broader market. This is an important step. 3, it's very important at this stage to look at the asset liabilities and therefore to have a more balanced sheet approach. And I think this is also one of the issues that you are alluding to, is you need to look at not only where those investments are going, but you need to look at the overall balance sheet of the state. Of course, I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we will see a lot of changes happening. 2021 is already, we're witnessing certain number of major changes, and we will see more of that. The recovery in oil price that we are seeing in the beginning of 2021 should not lead us to forget that in the past, oil prices were very volatile and very much dependent on demand, but also on renewable energies. And it's a cycle that its peak will be reached somehow or somewhere between 2030 to 2050. And therefore, it's very important to maintain and accelerate the transformation and the transition to a new economic model. Last point, I would say here, and I would like to underscore, that the way those countries managed the crisis, both the sanitary one and the protection of their economy, was commendable, because very quickly they have introduced new technologies in terms of social distancing, in terms of providing new type of treatments, and a whole set of services that were provided electronically. And the utilization of digital was extremely fast in providing services, be it education, health, and also even government services. And also the fact that they invested heavily in vaccination, it's a step in the right direction. And clearly we see that their recovery is faster. And therefore, I think we are seeing here a new approach to dealing with crises. And I hope this is something that will last, because the past has showed us when you do too little, too late, you end up, in fact, in the worst situation, because you will not achieve the targets, but also the pain on people will be perceived without the gain that you are expecting. Therefore, I think it's an important moment here also to reflect on the overall role of the institutions going forward in the recovery.
Thank you, Dr. Azour. And this goes back to your point earlier about the importance of strengthening governance, because we've seen surveys, for example, by the Arab Barometer, looking at trust in governments, which was very much linked to their COVID-19 response. And of course, there are varying responses, but in countries like Jordan, Morocco, Algeria, there was actually pretty high trust in governments. And a lot of it had to do with, like you said, the early policies and measures taken to contain the virus, at least with phase one. Things changed with the second wave and and later on. So we have a number of questions coming in. I will start. Okay. We have question from John Alterman from CSIS. What is this fiscal space available to governments for their ongoing efforts to mitigate the effects of COVID? And what is the likely availability of external financing? Under what circumstances is such financing likely to be plentiful, and what sorts of circumstances are likely to leave local governments squeezed?
Thank you very much. John is raising an important question. Thank you, John, for your question. I think here we need to differentiate between countries. There are countries who have a level of buffers that are sufficient. And here mainly we're talking about some of the GCC countries, not all of them. We have countries who have been implementing certain number of reforms over the last 5 or 10 years, like Morocco or Egypt, who are and were able to withstand the shock and address the immediate impact by providing some social support, fiscal support. And we have those who have very limited or no fiscal space, countries where the level of debt has increased and reached a level of 90%. Therefore, I think the situation is different and each group has to be treated differently. On the other side, I think the sources of funding are multiple. At some point in time, in the beginning of the crisis in 2020, we saw a massive outflow of private money that could have put the region in a difficult position in 2020. Thanks to the certain number of changes that took place, starting from the monetary policy here in the US, the liquidity that was injected, we saw a reversal of that. Therefore, in terms of the private source of financing, the 2021, at least for the first half, still look promising in terms of providing enough liquidity at reasonably good rate to countries in the region. Several countries with high rating or even frontier markets were able to access international capital markets easily. For example, if I take the example of Morocco, who was able to raise funds for 10 years at even lower rate than the one that they could borrow from us, for example, from the fund. Therefore, access to private capital in terms of financing the needs of countries will remain available this year, but this is an issue that countries need to be very cautious, because any change in market sentiment, any increase in risk premium, or any shortages in liquidity could affect them, as we saw in 2012-13 with the taper tantrum globally that affected negatively the emerging markets. In terms of official funding, last year we were very bullish because it was a crisis like no other, and we understood that this is an exogenous crisis. It's a humanitarian crisis, and we needed as an institution to come very quickly. And we came, in fact, very quickly. We provided $17 billion. It represents an increase in 1 year of our financial outstanding to the region of 60%. It's the highest increase in lending for the fund in 1 year. And we came very quick. For example, in less than 3 weeks, we were able to provide support to Jordan, for example, in adapting their program, or provide rapid facility to Tunisia, the first country who got 100% of quota in terms of rapid financial facilities. And we increased our annual ceiling of providing financial resources to countries. But this is something that was very much focused to the needs of the moment. Now, the needs are changing, and also the form of our financial support is adjusting. Countries need to address the scars of this crisis, mainly on some key sectors like tourism, where we have high level of employment. And also, countries need to stabilize their economies for the medium term. And when we provided the liquidity line for Morocco last year, it allowed Morocco to increase the cushion. The same thing that when we provided $5.2 billion to Egypt, it also allowed Egypt not only to use this liquidity as reserves, but also to improve market perception. And therefore, also our role is not only to provide financing to countries, but also to provide or to allow through our funding the access to additional resources from multilaterals and also from the market. And this is our second mission this year. The third one is to help countries facing specific issues. And here, let me give the example of 3 countries. Sudan, with whom we are currently working in helping Sudan to reach what we call the decision point, the point where they can have debt relief. We are helping Iraq, and probably we will have with Iraq a program of rapid facility to allow Iraq to get access to liquidity and also to accompany the reform program that the government is implementing through their white paper. Lebanon is a third example where as soon as the government is formed, we will re-engage in order to help Lebanon address a huge set of challenges that would require not only the support of the fund, but also the support of other institutions and some of the bilaterals. Therefore, we're trying to adjust our role and make sure that, in fact, we create a synergy between us and other multilaterals, and us also and the private sources of funding.
Thank you, Jihad. So more questions coming in. We have a question from Val Matthews, International Business and Technology. Do you see oil and gas exporting countries succeeding in diversifying their economies in the coming years?
Well, Val, this is a question or an issue that those countries have tried to deal with over the last 5 or 6 years, with the Saudis' 23rd division, with the UAE plan, with the Bahrain 2025 plan, etc. And what we're seeing today is 3 levels of diversification. One at the economic sectors. Many countries have invested heavily in service sectors. Of course, some of those sectors were affected by the COVID-19 crisis because they were affected by the social distancing issues. And some of them were relying on the global value chain, like in logistics and other type of activities. What we're seeing here is a kind of repositioning in order to make sure that the size, the scope, and the nature of those activities will adjust and align with the new shape and form of globalization. We're seeing also countries betting on the future, like, for example, UAE investing in renewable technology, hydrogen, other type of new sources of energy, and considering that the energy business is their platform, not only fossil fuels. And I think this goes in the direction that we're seeing globally. And the third source of diversification, so to speak, in economies is to invest more and more in small and medium-sized enterprises and startups, which was one of the pieces that was missing in their private sector strategy. But this is not the only source of diversification. There are 2 other sources of diversification. One, I mentioned it earlier, diversification of revenues in order to allow the state to be less dependent on oil revenues and to be less pro-cyclical. Give you an example. In 2020, the drop in oil price costed the GCC countries more than $220 billion of revenues. And therefore, this is what led, for example, Saudi to adjust the VAT rate and others to think about new type of revenues. The third level of diversification is diversifying or allowing for greater diversity in the labor, both in their local labor market as well as also in the foreign labor. And I think this is also a step in the right direction, because this will allow them to attract high-skilled labor that will feel more included in the labor market. And with this inclusion, will allow the economy to grow. Last but not the least is increasing the role of women in the economy. I mentioned it earlier. This is a huge boost over time for economic growth. It's not only to improve the level of inclusion, but also to improve the level of economic performance. It requires still a certain number of adjustment in laws, in regulations, in certain practices. Access to finance is still segregating between women and men. Certain number of infrastructure in terms of social infrastructure are still needed in order to accelerate that. But this is a trend that would require at least 5 to 10 years to see the results there.
Thank you, Jihad. Another question coming in, and you've already talked about the role of technology, but perhaps to delve a little bit deeper into that, from Manuel Langendorf, who's an independent research and journalist. What role do you foresee for digital skills in terms of workforce development and creating economic growth in the MENA region?
Well, Manuel, as you know, this region is blessed by 2/3 of its overall population being below 30. Tax savvy, educated, and using technology in a very, I would say, smooth and flexible way. And also this region need to create in the next 5 to 10 years more than 25 to 30 million new job opportunities. Only fast-growing sectors will allow this. And those sectors that are growing fast globally are sectors that are very much invested in technology. Therefore, this is, if there is one area to invest in, is in technology, providing better access to remote education. This also proved to be one of the challenges this year or last year. Second, we saw that youth were facing the challenge of remote working, and this would require a certain number of adaptation. The same also apply for women. We saw that technology also helped in improving or accelerating for certain countries the capacity to reopen the economy, like in some of the GCC countries. Therefore, technology will be critical in the future. But technology should not be only focusing on easing access to services. It has to transform the way production is being done, the way education is being provided, and the way inclusion is being achieved. It should not become a source of increasing divide between those who have access to technology and those who don't have access to technology. There are pluses and there are also minuses in technology, and those minuses need to be addressed. One of the important elements is countries should not focus on their own market and be inward looking. In technology, you need to create standards. You need to create platforms that allow many to participate in. And if countries start, for example, in terms of mobile money, let me use this example that I know well and that we are trying to help countries accelerate. If each country will develop his own standards in terms of technology for mobile money, it's very difficult to create a fluid and reasonably active digital currency or digital payment in the region. Therefore, you need to have here the capacity to break certain rules that existed in the past or certain, I would say, barriers that existed between countries. And this is the new way of regional cooperation, is to cooperate through a certain number of practices, standards, and not through the top-down approach, whereby it's only done by policymakers. It has to be done also by practitioners. And you need to allow practitioners here to build this. And therefore, we encourage countries in the region to think together about those solutions and to open up a new space of cooperation that can be led by the private sector. And the last word is the private sector. And most of the countries in the region, the state is still relatively crowding out the private sector. And it's impossible if you want to grow an economy with technology as its backbone, not to allow innovation. And innovation comes with the startups, comes with the private sector.
Thank you, Jihad. And a question to follow up on the point on regionalization and partnerships moving forward from Mohammed Abu Hawash. Where does the Arab League's role fit into the economic outlook for 2021 for the recovery, for flexibility and resiliency of the MENA economies this year?
Well, the region has a set of institutions that were built, I would say, long time ago. And some of them were pioneered in terms of building them. Like, for example, the Arab Monetary Fund, one of the rare regions who has set an equivalent to the IMF for a regional purpose. The same thing also for the Arab Fund for Economic and Social Development. Therefore, those institutions are important. We need to update their mandate. We need to make them more relevant for what the world needs in the postmodern globalization. The world is changing, and all institutions currently in the world are trying to question their model. We see that the G20 last year, that was shared by Saudi and shared successfully by the Saudis, changed the way their priorities were set in order to give more space to help countries deal with their debt or address issues of fighting the COVID-19 crisis. Therefore, I think those institutions are still important because they exist, they have a mandate, they need to be maybe looking at what are the priorities for the next 30 to 50 years and how their role, how their mandate, and how their organization and even their decision-making system need to be adjusted to that. When the EU was created almost at the same time or after, has evolved tremendously over the last 50, 70 years, while our institutions did not. And I think it's a time also now to go back to the drawing board, not to shut down those institutions, on the contrary, is to remodel their role and adapt their mandate to the needs of the future, and also to a project that can be an ambition for the future. The region is fragmented, we all know that, at several fronts. Statistics are showing, even in terms of trades of goods and services, it's among the least integrated, but also there are other areas where you can improve in terms of partnership, partnering in technology, partnering in climate, partnering in certain number of standards. Those are avenues for the future, and those are also potential for accelerating growth in the future.
Thank you, Jihad. A question from John Top Christensen on Lebanon. So what is the road forward for Lebanon, especially in regard to managing their huge public debt?
Well, John, as you know, Lebanon is facing one of the most challenging crises because it's a compilation of different types of crises. It started with an economic, fiscal, and financial crisis, and that was exacerbated by the fact that inflation and negative growth led to a social, huge social disaster with an increased number of vulnerabilities, the number of people who lost their job or moved into the poverty situation was tremendous in terms of challenge for the Lebanese population. And this, on top of that, Lebanese had to face last year one of the dramatic explosion that affected their capital and also their society, and the outbreak of the COVID-19 with the second wave that is much stronger than the first one. What Lebanon needs is known. Lebanon needs a comprehensive reform program that addresses all the challenges that Lebanon is facing, that brings confidence back and trust of citizens, trust of investors, and trust of the international community. Because without it, it's very difficult to see the economy recovering, the Lebanese investing, and the international community assisting. Bringing confidence back requires to address some of the problems of the past, what we call the problems of the stock, the debt, the liabilities of the state, the challenges that the financial sector is facing. But this is not enough. You need also to rebuild an economy that can recover fast. And for that, you need to address some of the key sectors that have prevented Lebanon in the past from growing, like energy reform, the reform of the electrical sector, telecom, etc. Those sectors are critical in helping the economy to recover fast. 3, that is becoming more important than ever, change the social protection strategy that is currently more favoring a certain number of goods that are subsidized, that are not helping the poor, and recalibrate the way social assistance is being provided to target those who need it. And Lebanon is a country that has huge potential, and without investing in people, it's very difficult for Lebanon to recover fast. And therefore, you need to preserve the good quality of education and the good quality of health services. Without that, it's very difficult for an economy that is vibrant and proved in the past capacity to recover, to do so. We as an institution, we stand ready. We were in a discussion with the authorities. Unfortunately, when the government resigned, we don't have, I would say, an official counterpart so far. We're still providing support in terms of technical assistance. And we stand ready as soon as the government is formed to re-engage the discussions with them.
Great, thank you. Another debt-related question from Fadi Samara. Many countries whose economies contracted, like Egypt and Jordan, were economically suffering prior to the pandemic, with unemployment, account deficits, and debt to GDP, etc. How does a country like Jordan begin to recover from the pandemic and then recover again from pre-pandemic economic problems without incurring more debt?
Well, Fadi is raising an issue that is, I would say, relevant to several countries in the region. Let me say a few things on Jordan, and then I will broaden it. Jordan was able last year to act very quickly. As soon as they had to face the first wave of the COVID shock, they activated certain number of policies in order to protect lives, to protect livelihoods. They have provided certain number of additional support through the central bank liquidity facilities to several sectors. Of course, Jordan has a high level of debt, but they were able to increase their fiscal space. And we, as an institution, we helped them. We gave them in the program that we were, in fact, we had negotiated with them and signed a few weeks before the outbreak of the COVID. We provided them with adjusters in order to allow them to increase the level of spending on social. Any country, even a country who has high level of debt, should focus on one and the utmost priority is to protect lives. And therefore, whatever it takes, countries need to do this. Those who have fiscal space, they can use it. Those who don't, they need to reallocate resources within the same envelope. And this is also something that Jordan did. What Jordan needs going forward is to accelerate growth. Why? Because in addition to the macroeconomic vulnerability in terms of debt, the big one is the increase in the level of unemployment. And the unemployment at the youth level is one of the major issues that Jordan is facing. For that, you need to reduce the cost of production. And we welcome what Jordan is trying to do currently by reducing the cost of energy, reducing the cost of labor. Of course, Jordan has to face problems that are outside of Jordan's control. The tension that exists in the neighboring country that prevent Jordan from playing a regional role. But here, again, by increasing productivity, Jordan can regain some of the lost ground. Having said that, addressing the vulnerabilities also will require to keep an eye on the fiscal sustainability, and fiscal consolidation will remain an important step. But here you can do it differently by increasing the level of flexibility in the way the budget is being implemented, gives you additional space, by reforming without increasing the tax burden, by making it more effective, by eliminating some of the special schemes that are, I would say, not favoring those who need it. By adjusting some of the loopholes in the system, you can create additional resources without increasing the burden on the low-income and middle-income people. Of course, going forward, it's very important to accelerate through improving productivity, the capacity of the economy to recover. This will not be easy because Jordan, like many other countries in the region, are facing the uncertainty of the speed of the recovery. But I think the government has the resolve and took certain number of important steps, despite the fact that they were facing the COVID-19 crisis. But this is definitely an issue that several countries in the region are facing. Lebanon, to a much bigger extent, but Tunisia also, and other countries where the level of debt because of negative growth and increase in deficit jumped up. And this is why it's very important to anchor any policy in the medium term to make sure that we achieve macroeconomic stability, even if we can allow countries some flexibility in the short term. And this cannot be done without accelerating the structural reforms that will allow the subsidy system to be more targeted and finish the unfinished business of the antiquated type of subsidy that is for fuel or gasoline that doesn't serve any social purpose. Increase the level of social spending that is lacking in the region. And also grow the size of the net by bringing more people who are in the informal sector to be in the formal sector and help them in this process.
Thank you, Jihad. We have 3 more questions and about less than 10 minutes left. So I'll sort of try to bundle them, and you can try to answer them. So one question from Javad Salehi Isfahani, who's a professor of economics at Virginia Tech. What are the chances for the $5 billion loan to Iran to go through? And then another question coming in from Micheline Eshai, professor at the University of Denver. How can economic opportunities increase if they're based on the ends of conflicts and social unrest? What regional mitigators need to be involved for these opportunities to gain fruition?
Thank you. On the first question on Iran, Iran has requested a financial support from the fund back in April last year. And there is a handful number of countries in the world where we are still working on those requests. And this is not only the case for Iran in our region, there are also other countries in the region where we are still not able to provide financial assistance, like Lebanon and Iraq until recently. We still need some information to be able to assess the needs. As you know, for any fund facility, we need to demonstrate 2 things, even if there are no conditions. One is there is balance of payment need, and the second, the capacity to repay. And with Iran, we didn't have an Article 4 since 2018, which in fact made us in need for more time in order to get access to the information we need. As I said, there are still few number of countries in the world that we are still in the process of assessing those cases, and Iran is one of them. But we recognize that the challenge that Iran is facing, and we are in constant, I would say, discussion with the authorities in order to see how we could help in terms of technical assistance, because in addition to the challenge of the first and the second wave of COVID, there are a certain number of issues especially on the social front, that requires to change and improve the social protection measures in order to increase the level of targeting, address some of the challenges that exist because of the weaknesses in the financial system and the multiplicity in the exchange rate, as well as also allow the Iranian economy to grow at a faster pace to provide enough jobs to the population. And this brings me to the second question. What can be done regionally? I think work has to be done at 3 levels. National, and this is the first and the most important element. This crisis has revealed the weaknesses that we knew in the past, but were more exacerbated. One is the social protection needs to be redesigned in order to be more targeted. A recent study that we issued showed that the level of social spending is relatively low. And there is a positive correlation between social and economic growth. Second, informality and vulnerabilities. Inclusion is critical in making this region more stable and making this region able to grow faster and also use and benefit from its full potential. We are still below in terms of inclusion for women and for the youth, and there are reasons for that. We need to improve in our education system in order to accelerate the capacity of our young population and the less young in order to be tech savvy, ready to work into the new economy. We need to invest in some of the social services that allow women to have the capacity to participate further in the economy. We need to improve access to finance that is limited to those groups for them to be able to invest, create jobs, and innovate. Therefore, inclusion is an important dimension. Improving governance is not only important to increase the capacity of the state to provide good services to their population, but to narrow the gap of confidence and trust between citizen and state, but also to change the role and the mandate of the state, whereby the state will become the enabler, will provide the framework, and will allow the economy to have the right set of infrastructure, not only physical, but also legal and soft infrastructure to grow. And this, for example, is something that is lacking in the region when you compare the region in terms of doing business, in terms of some other indicators in procurement, etc. We are still have a way to improve for us to attract more FDIs and also to provide more assurance to investors to come and invest. And this also requires to reform the legal system. Therefore, improving governance is also an important dimension. At the national level, also, there is something that this crisis has revealed. The size of informal sector is not helping those economies to grow. And unless we reduce the informality, we will reduce the chances of using or benefiting from all these talents that are in the informality today. At the regional level, I think what is important to show that cooperation means more partnership than only a top-down political agreements. And partnership has to be concrete and has to be forward-looking. Technology is one area, climate is another area, and there are also several other areas where countries can promote partnership. Without this partnership, it's not something that will sustain because people will not feel the benefit and the benefit over a long period of time. One of the issues that we saw also last year is remittances, which is the lifeline of many populations in many fragile states and countries, is also important. And we encourage countries to treat their foreign labor the same way they treat their own citizens. And we keep recommending this. We saw very good steps taking place last year and this year, both in terms of social protection and also in terms of vaccination. This is something that is very important going forward. There is also another issue that requires regional, with international support, but regional dealing, refugees. The region is hosting more than 25 to 27 million refugees or internally displaced. This is a toll that countries cannot withstand without some regional support. And here also, we recommend that using the vaccine diplomacy could provide and heal some of the wounds of the past. Of course, countries are currently faced with huge number of challenges and may, in the prioritization, forget regional dimension. But I think, and we think, that it's something that could become a new frontier for growth and recovery in the region.
Thank you very much, Dr. Azour. We are running out of time. This was a very rich discussion, and we had excellent questions from those who have tuned in. So thank you all for your questions. There's a lot more to discuss, but thank you so much for providing us with a very clear outlook of both challenges, but also opportunities moving forward. And the focus, I think, on cooperation in the form of partnerships, not only to mitigate the impact of the pandemic, but also looking forward and ahead for the region to rebuild and thrive, I think is critical and is a key message that we will also make sure to take forward to policymakers here in Washington. So thank you again for joining us, for your time. Thank you, Ambassador Jeffrey, for being with us this morning as well. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. And we look forward to more discussions in the future. Thank you all.
Thank you.